Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Bridgitte Barclay from Aurora University, to discuss ecological horror. I'm so glad that you joined us today. Dr. Barclay writes and teaches about gender and the environment, including reflections on science fiction, graphic novels, and contemporary American literature. Dr. Barclay has written in Unbound, a journal of digital scholarship, the Horror Homeroom, and the journal Science Fiction, Film, and Television. Your work has been described quite frequently as a critique of ecological horror and the monsters that challenge the world. So I just wonder, how does this appear in shows that have nature strikes back against the humans narrative?
That's a good question. Yeah.
So maybe you could explain a little bit more what eco-horror is.
Yeah, of course.
And maybe how it relates to climate change as an example.
Yeah, as we know, a lot of times when there's horror, there's some kind of creature, there's an element in there, right? So I talk a lot about creature features as well. And so not all of those eco-horrors or creature features have to be deliberately environmental. So sometimes we can read environmental themes into them. So I talked about frogs, I've talked about Gamera and Godzilla in this way. There are ways in which you can read creature from the Black Lagoon. So there are ways in which you can take those, maybe they weren't intended to be environmental or eco-horror when they were made, but there's a good way we can read them now, decades later especially, and thinking about how it ties in with environmental themes that we're seeing now. A lot of this was before we understood the enormous amount of extinctions that we have in the Anthropocene. So sometimes we can look at something that's decades old and see the problematic narratives.
Would Frankenstein be a...
It would be an interesting one. I think it would be a really interesting one. I haven't thought about it as a creature feature, but I think it's a creature that's its body's put together, right? And I think it works really well, and it hits that. So a lot of times horror or science fiction hits those places where we think about what we fear in the world, of course, right? And so it's notable that there's been a lot more feminist horror and horror about environmental issues in the last 10 years, especially. So that shows that we have anxieties about those things right now.
Yeah, we feel threatened by many things,
Right.
which could be something like climate change, the floods, the hurricanes,
Right.
the fires, right?
Yeah,
so
all of
that's
that.
threatening all of us.
Yeah, extinctions.
Extinctions of animal species, of whole species. So. Although you write about eco-horror and how it relates to climate disasters, you also suggest that rather than warning humans of impacts on the natural world, 20th century movies used plants, animals, aliens as allegories for other things like the Red Scare, nuclear threats, fear of enemies.
Yeah.
But you concluded that their deeper threat may be patriarchy and violence against women. Could you explain the connection between ecological horror and patriarchy, for the lack of a better word?
Oh, I can explain this. I love this topic. So it goes back to, we think about Teddy Roosevelt, made some of the most national parks, right? Did all these, supplied the Smithsonian with way more species than they needed from different African nations, right? When he went on some of the expedition tours. So he was just shooting his gun everywhere he went, but he was also, so he did a lot of great things, but when he created those national parks, he also took land from indigenous folks, right? This was also a very social level and race issue. He also used to lead folks into men who needed to be less feminine. He would lead these camps out into the wilderness to spend time. And so that was one of his concerns.
Toughening them up, to make them...
effeminate men, he felt like women were kind of messing things up. So you can, even in the early parts of how we function as a nation, it's already sort of tied together. And now we know that there are reports of, so if you look at RAINN, against sexual assaults and things, so one of the organizations that keeps statistics on these, we know that there's a big, in the Venn diagram of like school shootings and masculinity and race and misogyny, there's a lot of overlap with all of those. So folks that are eco-fascists. We can think about them as either as eco-fascists, or we can think about them as folks who they think that only certain people should own the land in some ways, right? So when I compare this, when I'm talking to my students about it, I'll explain that when you look at the Dakota Access protests, not long, right around that near time, there was also the standoff with, I want to say it was the Bundy family, but it was a white ranching family.
Yes, out in California.
Handled very differently, right? So even with that, just who we give value to and being able to have a stand on their land, right? And that was public land, right? So, and the other was tribal land. So there was even that kind of difference. It's always tied together in really interesting ways. One of the things that got me into this area of study that I've been in recently is thinking about, Sarah Crosby had a presentation at a conference, Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, a few years ago. And she was making this really cool connection between the audience for most crime podcasts is women. And we also know that women are the people who are most often targeted, right? And so I started really wondering about this. And then it was also like there's a lot of podcasts that focus, even if you look at the cover of their podcast imagery, it's got forests in the background or a river, it's like women going out into the natural world could be dangerous. And so Sarah Crosby made this great point that even in these most progressive feminist podcasts that really want to support women, they're also saying, but it's dangerous to be out there in the world by yourself, right? And so I think that became really intriguing to me, but I started thinking that final girl that walks in, which is something we should define, I guess, too. Does that make a difference? Okay.
Well, yeah, but we'll if we don't mind, we'll get to that, because I have some questions about the final girl. But in Space Cowboys and Alien Landscapes, you recover Lee Brackett's writing. She was often dismissively, I guess, called the Queen of the Space Opera. Yes.
As though that's a negative.
Yeah, yes. But we know she influenced Ray Bradbury and even George Martin of Game of Thrones fame.
Yes.
They both testified that they were highly influenced by her lead. So, but early on, she wrote westerns like Rio Bravo and crime dramas like The Big Sleep. She died before Empire Strikes Back was released. But it was her screenplay that some would argue made the sequel to Star Wars a major hit. It drew $550 million from the box office. So, and you wrote that Brackett's influence in science fiction not only made Star Wars, but laid the groundwork for disrupting the science-nature binaries, which leads me to a question. What is the science-nature boundary?
It's a good question, yeah. So especially in that time in the mid-century, she was writing 40s, 50s, 60s for the most part, and up until the 70s when she died. But she also, during that time, militarized science, as we can imagine after Second World War. Young folks who were watching movies and reading some of the pulps that she was writing in did not agree with militarized science, right? And so she kind of pitted, and with nuclear testing, we can imagine, and the Cold War kicking in, there's all these ways in which the natural world was being damaged by science that was at the service of the militaries, governments, right? And so a lot of that testing sort of kicked off some of the women's environmental movements in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of them were mothers who were noticing in the Southwest, were saying, our children's teeth are falling out way too early, right? And so they were writing into Congress.
Was that because of nuclear, being near nuclear facilities?
Yeah, and we know that it's still happening, right? That people are still suffering from those things in the Pacific with all that testing. It followed us through with Agent Orange into Vietnam, right? So that war on nature is literally a war on nature at sometimes, right? And women were often taking up those causes as mothers, seeing differences in their children in those areas that were hit the hardest.
So again, there's the intersection of gender, resistance by gender, and the ecology, the threat to humanity, the threat of extinction.
You get a bunch of women mad about things they care about, and they come together.
You also suggested when you wrote about Brackett that she was an early feminist science fiction writer, and she advanced what you call eco-criticism, including the rejection of violence, which you just mentioned, as a means to achieve change. But I'm not sure, maybe you could unpack eco-criticism for our viewers.
Of course, of course. So eco-criticism could cover a number of things. I focus on pop culture and gender generally, right? So, and I like the 50s to 60s era, although I do more recent stuff as well. It's just taking a look at what are the big questions, what are the big understandings, how do those underscore policies we're creating. So whatever we believe about the world starts changing the way we start changing the world, right? So for instance, if we think about manifest destiny, if we think we own everything and that nature is under humans, then that changes the policies we're making, right? Or if we think indigenous folks don't deserve choices on what happens on their tribal land.
Or if wolves are a threat to ranchers.
Absolutely.
Like in Montana, where I don't know how many wolves they killed in the last couple months, but it's not true that the wolves are a threat to ranchers.
Not
but
generally,
they perceive that to be.
Yeah, and then we cause other trouble. Right? Yes. Wisconsin, we did this ages ago, right? Killed off gray wolves, and so then the deer population is damaging woodlands, right? And so it just, because they go out of control. We just kind of think we have control over things and we can fix a problem, and we end up causing more.
Well, when you wrote about manifest destiny, you said this equals extraction and extinction.
Yeah.
But how does manifest destiny mean both extraction? I can see the extraction because you're going to manifest destiny. That means that the U.S.
You're
can
going to go somewhere,
control,
get some resources.
right? You're going to get the resources. You're going to extract those. You're going to ship tomatoes to the U.S. and then sell ketchup back to Argentina.
right, exactly. Yeah.
But how does that relate to extinction? Extinction of what? Other species?
Lots of different species. So because a lot of that extraction, if you think about oil extraction equals, right? It equals we're causing more trouble. We're building more plastics with some of that petroleum. When we're fracking, we're putting water, the output water from fracking is going back into aquifers, right? So the aquifers are being damaged, and so then the land around is being damaged, and then the bird and animal and plant species and the people are being damaged as well. So there's no way that we can consume and not off-put with it equaling damage for certain extinctions. So there's a group in South Dakota working right now, for instance, I forget the group's name, but they go to every place that is a new fracking site. They go and they try to locate endangered species there so that they can take the company to court, right? Yep. And so it's because we know that that kind of drilling, if you've been to West Texas or if you've been to the Bakken and the Dakotas, you know what a drilling company looks like. An oil town looks like it's used up and then it's spit out. And so it's paved, it's right, they don't have to take things down off the coast of California, they don't have to take things down.
I did know that there was an indigenous group largely led by women in Canada that were defending First Peoples' rights, First Nations' rights.
I believe that,
And they were against what you're talking about. They were against the oil drilling. They were against destruction of the resources that was on the native land. So
taking nurturing sort of into, and it's interesting, there's a vein of environmental and gender studies that is eco, where it's like a sort of a Gaia version of like an ecofeminist is sort of this Gaia version of where it's a little too like Mother Earthy for my taste, right? But the idea is that they kind of hold on to the idea that the two are equated, that women know the natural world better. I don't know if I like that argument. I think it undermines a lot of other arguments for us in science. But
the idea that
certainly allies with my beliefs.
Jane Byrne or Hillary Clinton would be better if they were in charge, but that is not hasn't been the case because, as you say, women are watching the crime shows, even though the victims are women. So it's not necessarily true that just by having a female leader
that it always changes something,
that's
right?
Going to change
that
something.
Character matters one way or the other. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
So we now can talk about final girls.
Yeah, of course.
In many horror films, especially the slasher films, there's a final girl. And that's the last female character who confronts the killer, the monster. Invariably, the final girl is innocent, virginal, subservient. She doesn't drink. Beautiful. She doesn't do drugs. She's beautiful. Yes. But ironically, sometimes male viewers still have to identify with a woman by the time they get to the climax, because the woman is the one that finishes the killer or finishes the monster. So
Yeah.
I just find that
It's fascinating, isn't it?
it's ironic that
Yeah.
the male viewers go to see the slasher film,
And then this is what they
but they end up having to.
take on. But it's interesting because the camera angles are often of the male view, of the attacker's view. So it's some of those, one of the traits of the final girl sort of that are it's kind of gratuitous violence, especially
Yes.
sexualized violence. And so the camera angles are very much above the female as she's being attacked or hurt. And of course, inevitably, her clothes are slashed to where they're almost falling off,
Well,
right?
especially the early girls that get killed. Right? I mean, they're
Yeah.
blonde. No
Right,
offense,
yeah.
but
I hope I'm not getting killed tonight.
but they're blonde and
Yeah.
they're lascivious and they're
Yeah.
loose and
Yeah.
all these other things.
Yeah, if you're wearing
that
high
you're
heels
not-
and kissing a boy, you're going to get killed off real
that's,
quick.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and that's what most of the slasher films tend to do.
Yeah, but then they
Whereas-
also kind of fetishize the abuse of a woman.
Yeah.
So not only we're going to put these women into compartments, but then we're going to see what does punishment look like for them, right?
So maybe you can give us some examples of The Last Girl. I know in your writings you talked about
Yeah.
Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween.
Yeah.
There's probably several
Those
others.
are, I honestly don't focus on them too much because I focus on the ones that push back against
Oh,
that. But
yes.
yes, those are all of those that you said would fit with that, right? You want the Psycho. I don't know would work as well as some of the others because it doesn't have like sort of one of the hallmarks of the final girl in the way it's mostly those 70s, 80s, 90s
Yeah.
movies if we're thinking about them, and 2000s of course. But we have like this final girl who's everybody's died but her. It's usually dawn, right, when she emerges from the woods or from the house or from somewhere else, and she's splattered in blood.
She's escaping
She's
the
escaping.
ecological horror.
Yeah, not even like all of these don't have to be ecological too, right? Just the
Right.
horror for
Just,
that one.
Well, yeah, just being in the woods.
But if she's in the woods,
right?
that's shouldn't have been out there, right? Shouldn't have been at that party. Shouldn't have gone to that bonfire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that I think is really fascinating. There's this. There's been a movement since the last 10 years to kind of push back against that understanding of final girl, which is often very male-directed.
Yeah.
The viewership is
Yeah.
very male
Yeah.
at the time. Yep.
So, do some of the characters that I was just referencing, do they indicate a relationship between ecological horror and gender and violence?
They could. I don't know that I would always consider the slasher films to be environmental. I don't know if I don't read them as environmental because there's not, some of those it's just another man. It's not a hybrid. It's not a creature. It's not
not a creature,
they're not,
yeah.
if the setting is not in the natural world. So, like you could talk about the, like Elm Blight on Nightmare on Elm Street and how that could be tied in, but I don't know that those slasher films are always like that. So that's I think it's interesting that some of the more recent eco-horror texts that we've seen have been not only female-directed, but also have reversed that trope,
Yeah.
right? So or expanded it. Maybe it's not reversed. They're not walking into, but they're surviving in a happy way. They want to be in the woods. That's where they can find justice because the world is not offering them justice. Not that that's a familiar idea right now
No,
or anything.
it's not. Although there are other movies, like I think that you mentioned in one of your writings, or
Yeah.
maybe a comment I got from you, a Promising Young Woman, which presents a story of revenge against sexual predators.
Yeah.
Apparently the protagonist's best friend was raped and killed.
Raped and videoed, and so it was,
And she committed
suicide.
suicide. So now she pretends to be drunk, and she goes out and finds men
Great movie.
that are trying to
Yeah.
take advantage of her because she appears to be drunk. But
Yeah.
and I guess she offs them.
Well, she often threatens them. So
Okay.
she mostly just, I don't want to I want you to see the movie, but she often just puts the fear of God in them. So
Okay.
she has some of that, and sometimes there's some places where it's left a little, you're not quite sure.
You're not quite sure what happens.
And it's by the film's end, it's a very different ending than you're expecting by the end of it, but she still gets the last word. So it becomes, I think it's a really cool one that she's not the final girl in an explicit way, but
Yep.
she's she has all of the final things. Everything turns out the way she wants it to. She finds the justice.
She wins.
Mm-hmm. She wins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meeting out justice. Okay.
Yes.
That's good. One of the things that may be expressed by a promising young woman, or in other films, the final girl seems to move from victimhood to survival. What's the material cause for that shift to survival? Because it seems to me, at least, that males still run Hollywood and still run the film industry. So what has happened?
For the most part, yeah. I will say that the ones that I wrote about are female directed, so I think that's a really important part.
That's one of the material
That's one of
things.
the material things that make us different. Also, the language around sexual assault and survivorship is very different than it used to be. So
Since Me Too?
phrasing changed from even before then. The phrasing instead of a victim has been changing to survivor, because it's not that this thing happens to you and that's how you're defined, but it's the fact that that someone who has been sexually assaulted then can survive and push forward and rebuild, and through the traumatic and the PTSD and all of that.
I would like to end with your observations about The Handmaid's Tale, the dystopian Handmaid's Tale, and also Land.
Yes.
Because in both of those, one's a TV series, the other one's actually a film. But they choose to have time in the woods, where the woods is no longer the threatening place so they choose to be there, which is a source of recovery, a source of empowerment, and they end up becoming protagonists rather than victims. Because, I mean, they survive cold, they survive hunger, and they thrive in the woods.
Yes.
Which seems to be
it goes against what we were talking about before, which I think makes it really, it's sort of rewriting the trope. So in both of those, there were protagonists beforehand, but they can't take care of their the world is not taking care of them. The systems, the justice system is not working for them, and so they take justice into their. It's more vigilante. Although one of them is about healing. Land is more about healing from masculinized violence. It was gun violence.
Land was like that,
yeah,
right?
Land is more that. And
because
then,
a bear attacks her.
It has all the makings of horror.
The roof goes off the ceiling.
Yeah.
She's hunger.
Yeah.
But
there's a silhouette of a strange man walking in at one point. It hits all of the visual buttons of horror, but it's not horror. It's sort of this healing, which I find just fascinating the way they just juxtaposed those two.
And in both The Handmaid's Tale and Land, they have some empowerment because of their retreat to the woods.
Yeah.
So the woods is not a place that you want to avoid,
right.
Or even the roof coming off your cabin isn't necessarily. The end
the worst
of
thing. They can handle it, right? I think that's a big part of it. It's like they can handle fixing it. And with Handmaid's Tale, that was one of the things that helps a lot too, is that thinking through the fact that have you watched The Handmaid's Tale, the series? So the very first, one of the early scenes is them, I think it might be the first scene, is them running through with their child trying to get to Canada, right? They're pulled over, they're having to run through the woods, right? And so in the scene that I write about, the season finale for the last season that was on, what we think about is she wants to go back into the woods. She wants him to run. She says, "I want him to feel like I did that day in the woods." And all of the shots are of them chasing. So if you just looked at many women chasing him, the commander, who's been systematically raping people, right? So the whole system is set up so where rape is legalized in the form of marriage. So it's all of these survivors that are chasing the commander, and it looks like a horror movie. It looks like it would normally look like a horror movie in the sense that it's usually the men chasing one woman, and it was vice versa. They gave him a choice, and he chose to run, and they enjoyed chasing him. Bit his face off, I believe, at the end, right?
That's too much.
Not his whole face, just a part of it.
Well, that's almost all the time we have. I didn't know if there was anything that you would like to close with, some general comment.
I just wanted to talk about how important this stuff is right now, especially as we're thinking about the reversal of Roe versus Wade in 2022, and right now, as we're losing funding for a lot of the EPA and environmental justice issues, it's a relevant topic.
DEA. And
yep.
I also think about Israel's war in Gaza and the U.S. support for that and the killing of women in particular, but women and children. So it's like
absolutely.
Talk about
Talk
about a horror. That probably raises right to the top level
and
of what horror can be.
Media is under attack, and colleges are under attack. So doubly,
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank
you. That's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Bridgitte Barclay for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. We'll see you next time.